afternoon, everybody. I just want to say thank you all for being here. I know I've heard that J. Cole is in the vicinity, so thank you. It's really humbling to see such a turnout for what is an urgent but also timeless conversation, so thank you all so much. This is a conversation among two people, Dr. Patricia Rodney and Dr. Carole Boyce-Davies, who need no introduction, but I will still do so anyway. Dr. Patricia Rodney is an eminent figure in public health, someone who has both innovated the field and built and rebuilt institutions to train future generations of worldly, conscientized public health practitioners. She holds a PhD from the University of Toronto and an MPH from Emory. She spent 15 years at Morehouse School of Medicine, where she was promoted to MPH Program Director and the inaugural Assistant Dean for Public Health Education. It is an understatement to say that her work is at the center of transformative change through health, education, and social justice. She's also the CEO of the Walter Rodney Foundation, where Dr. Patricia Rodney carries her love of family as a champion of her family's legacy. She does this through programs, publications, and institutional collaborations, hopefully including with Howard. I wanted to announce, if you want to have more information about the foundation, please visit walterrodneyfoundation.org. And please save the date, April 9th to 10th, the 22nd annual Walter Rodney Symposium, which will be held at Brown University. I would love to see some of our people attending that. So again, that is walterrodneyfoundation.org to see more of their programs and publications. Dr. Carole Boyce-Davies is a world-renowned scholar of African diaspora and Black feminist studies. As many of us in this room will know, Dr. Boyce-Davies currently serves as the chair and professor of African diaspora literatures at Howard. This was coming after her tenure as the Frank Rhodes Professor Emerita at Cornell University. Dr. Boyce-Davies has over 100 articles and many foundational books. I've read and taught many times her Left of Karl Marx, which is an extraordinary and brilliant biography of the genius, communist, and Black feminist Claudia Jones. So read that, please. She's a global luminary of cultural studies, global Black women's studies, and I'm so humbled at the opportunity to have these just extraordinary people in conversation with us today. I'm deeply, deeply moved to be in his presence. I want to get to the conversation, but I do have to do a bit of the pro forma of announcing our deep gratitude for those who've made this event possible. First of all, of course, all of you for being in attendance today. I have to first thank deeply the Center for African Studies, led by the eminent Dr. Krista Johnson, the Center for Women, Gender, and Global Leadership, under the leadership of Dr. Anita Plummer, the Center for an Equitable Economy and Sustainable Society, led by Dr. Michael Ralph. Thanks as well to Dr. Kebimulanya for our collaboration, and the Departments of African Studies, Afro-American Studies, and Media Studies. Huge thanks as well to the African Studies Graduate Students Association, ASGSA, especially to Ambacho Mjulo and Innocent Ekujuba. And lastly, my heartfelt thanks to Milton Alamadi, without whom this event would not be possible. So thank you. He is a PhD student in the Howard History Department. I wanted to think about this conversation as well. Howard University has the motto of truth and service, which can be interpreted in multiple ways. And I want to offer this conversation as a more progressive or radical invitation to think about service as very, as grounded as opposed to on high. And with that, I want to welcome Dr. Carole Boyce-Davies and Dr. Patricia Rodney. Left of Patricia Rodney.
Ready? Hi everyone, and thank you. This is such a great audience. Nice, sunny day outside after the horrors of the last 2 weeks. So, I think the weather signifies something for us, Caribbean women. So let me tell you all something by way of introduction, and I told Pat last night, I was a grad student here in African Studies at Howard doing African Lit during the time of C.L.R. James, and I used to date a guy who was in with a James acolyte, you know, there are quite a few of them, and he told me, of course, of an event where Rodney was speaking here. So that was the first and only time I ever saw Walter Rodney in conversation. He's lecturing, but I say conversation because the students were giving him a hard time. There was a time when they would like argue down points, all the dogmas and the fine points of Marxism that he wasn't doing and so on. So just letting you know, it's like a full circle moment for me just to be able to have this position that I'm able to reflect on that, reflect on him, and talk to Pat, my dear friend, who reminded me we met in Barbados, and our children were little at the time. Our children were little at the time when we met. And then the other key point for students in the room, you all need to hear this. I worked exactly in this room as a library assistant when I was a student here, exactly here. And it was called a browsing room because it had chairs and you could come in, sit. It was more like a relaxed space. You could come and sit and read newspapers. Back then, there were newspapers on racks. And you got everything, the New York Times, the papers from London or wherever else that the university ordered. So it was that kind of space, but it also did film. It showed every now and then really ancient films, so students could come and look at the old genre of black film and so on every now and then. So it's, and whenever I come in this room, I always have that feeling, who knows that when you're a student doing the normal things that students do, that you have an opportunity later on in life to come back full circle and be here in a different capacity. So we expect all of you to be doing similar things later on, just letting you know. So I was so pleased when I realized Pat was going to be here. We've met so many times in different contexts, as she indicated, first in Barbados. But I was telling her that, and other friends as well, that the media during the Venezuela invasion and the kidnapping of Maduro and the stealing of the oil and so on, that the pirating of the oil, let me use the right language, by the US, and the blockade of Cuba, that people, even the media, popular media people, have very little knowledge of the geography, very little knowledge of that geography. They had no idea how close Trinidad is to Venezuela, like 11 kilometers, 7 miles. We can see Venezuela from certain parts of Trinidad, depending on how high up you are in a building. In nighttime, you can hear the radio stations, Spanish and so on. And in certain parts of the Saudi Caucasus, for example, certain days you can see the landmass that is Venezuela. So the fact that Trinidad was used as the launching point for some of that US invasion was always very troubling for us with that sort of Pan-Africanist history and background that comes out of Trinidad. But people miss the fact as well that Trinidad has a large Indian population and the current leadership is Indian now, and sometimes the politics of that group may take a different turn. So just letting you know, not all of them, but definitely this time, in a negative way. So Pat, one of the first things we want to hear from you, tell us a little bit about Guyana, because Guyana is right next door as well to Venezuela. And the Caribbean Airlines always stops in Piarco first sometimes, and I say always, but sometimes maybe more accurate, and before it goes to Guyana. So tell us about home, tell us about places you credit with your early formations, and any kind of values you think you got from that experience.
Okay, before we begin the conversation, I want to say how honored I am to be here on the 100th celebration of Black History Month. And the relationship that Rodney has had with his institution. Actually, on his way home to Guyana in 1974, he was here at Howard for a conference, and the different student organizations picketed outside the Guyanese embassy when he was refused the position at the University of Guyana. And then in 2000, I think there was a memorial conference held here for Rodney, and the late Dr. Rex Nettleford was part of that conference. So our relationship goes back a long time. My sister-in-law, Kathy Scott, Rodney Scott, got her PhD here in sociology. So, yeah. So I just wanted to say how happy I am to be here, to return. And I met with the director when the publishing house, because Howard was the first U.S. to publish How Europe Developed Africa, Howard University Press. So.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, but Guyana.
Oh.
We want to know the story. How did she meet Walter and all that?
Oh. I grew up in. Can you hear?
Can you hear?
Can you hear me? No.
Oh, you
Okay.
hold it closer.
Okay. I grew up in Georgetown, Guyana. Both my parents were working class, but education for, I think, most Caribbean people is very important, not just to move you into a different social class, but also for you to contribute and give back to your community. So I grew up in a very, I would say, extended family. In Guyana, a lot of women in particular came from the other islands to work in Guyana. So my mother's network, maybe women from St. Lucia, Antigua, and so I had a sense, I never had a sense of just being Guyanese. I always thought of myself as a Caribbean woman. And during school holidays, my father always sent us off to the country, Buxton, which is a famous village. Buxtonians were known to fight the British. My uncle and aunt were farmers, and so we spent all our summer vacation or school vacation in Buxton. But Buxton was unique because it's the first time we celebrated Ghana independence. So somebody would always come from Ghana. They were always a prince. Whether a prince or not, they were always prince, so coming. But there's always women wearing African clothes. There was drumming and dancing. So that kind of opened my eyes to not just Guyana, but to the rest of the world. And then when I was about 11 or 12, Guyana was the first British colony to have a socialist government, which did not last very long. We woke up one morning as children and the British had invaded. So we saw soldiers with guns all over Georgetown. And the Constitution was suspended. So we were the first, even before Cuba, to have an attempt at a socialist revolution. And that's how my husband was able to go to university, because he got a scholarship from the PPP government. We had this PPP government, which was a multiracial government. It was the first. So Cheddi Jagan was the leader and Burnham was the deputy leader. And then they broke up for reasons, ideological reasons, but also we learned later on that Burnham was being funded by the US government and the CIA. So the party broke along racial lines. So most of the black people went with the Burnham and the Indians went with Jagan. Some people didn't. My household, for example, my father remained with the PPP, and my father was a non-practicing Catholic. My mother stayed with the PNC and she was a Methodist. So we kind of grew up in the Methodist church. So, I think my influence is a lot of the things I learned about community, about integrity, about honesty came from my mother. She did a lot of work in the church. We always had a lot of people around who were not family, but extended family. People could just drop by and get a meal. She was that kind of person, and that kind of, I think I inherited that. I also inherited her green fingers. She was a fabulous gardener. She grew roses and sunflowers. And my father always said to her, if you grow food the way you grow flowers, you'll be rich. But I love flowers too. I grow vegetables and I love flowers. So those, and I'll never forget, my nursery school teacher was an amazing woman. She was fierce. And she would say to my mom, we were like 3 years old, she said to me, these girls, you know, she said, this is a mixed environment, boys and girls. So these girls must wear pantaloons. You know, yeah, she was amazing. But she had a big influence, I think, on me finding my voice from very small. But also, ironically, Jessie Burnham, who was a sister of Forbes Burnham, was my primary school teacher, an amazing woman. And she, under the PPP government, was the first, she was a minister of education, a junior minister of education, but she taught me at primary school. And she was an amazing teacher. She did not leave the PPP. She stayed with the PPP and did not go with her brother. And so it's a long story. He maligned her character and everything. But she, I think, is one of my heroes. I think she was an amazing woman, and one of these days I want to write about her because there were some significant women in that struggle in 1953. Jessie Burnham, there was another, Jane Phillips Gay, who was a trade unionist, and Janet Jagan, who was a nurse, an American.
Frank, I was going to say, technically Janet Jagan ends up being the first woman to be
prime minister in Guyana, even though she was, well, she gave up a U.S. citizenship when she moved to Guyana. Yeah. So those, yeah, how I met Walter.
Oh, wow. I thought she was going to pass that.
No. Growing up, everybody knew Walter Rodney because of his debating skills. He was a great debater at high school, and so a friend and I would always go to the debates because they were a huge thing. Because she liked one of the guys, I didn't. I wasn't interested in the guys because I thought Queen's College guys were known to be very obnoxious because they were assumed to be the prize of the society. So I met him informally, but wasn't interested. And then Walter went off to UWI and came home for Christmas. And we happened to meet at a party. House parties were things. And you had to be invited to these house parties. So I went to this party with my current boyfriend, and he went with his girlfriend. And somehow we managed to meet. I think he came up and asked me to dance, or would I like a drink or something. And then we got to talking. And when we were ready to leave, we couldn't find our partners. So we left together. And then he walked me home. Because that day we had no cars. You either rode your bicycle. We had bicycles, but we decided to walk so we could talk. And then the next day, we said our goodbyes. The next day, we bumped into each other at a christening. And we talked again, and then he was going back to UE, Jamaica, and I was going to London in that January to study nursing. And we just said, okay, we'll keep in touch, right? So those days, no telephone, writing letters, so we wrote to each other for like 2 years. And he came up on a visit, a brief visit to London, and then he was applying for graduate school. So he graduated from UE in 1963, and he told me later on he chose the University of London because I was in London, because he could have gone to Birmingham, so that's what he said. And so we started dating in London, and he went off to do his research for his thesis in Portugal. It's ironic that you have to research African history, you have to go to Europe. So he was in Spanish, he was in Spain and Portugal and Italy. And I went to visit him when he was in Portugal. And then he came back like the end of 64, the December. And when he got back in Germany, he asked me, will you marry me? Okay. So we got married. It was a quick romance. I'm jumping, but I remember meeting V.S. Naipaul in Tanzania, who was my neighbor for a little while because he came as a visiting professor. And if anybody knows Naipaul, he's very British. And so the students would complain about him, that they didn't like him. But he and I became best friends. We would go walking every day. And he said, I should write. He asked me about Walter and how we met. He said, that's so romantic. I should write something about that.
Wow, I hope you write this, Pat. This will be I'm glad it's being documented. This is lovely. This is a story. So, you know, the logic, though, of being in a relationship with somebody who had such a political journey around many different parts of the world meant that as the partner, and particularly in the days when wives often occupied what seemed to be a secondary role, but they were really partners doing all kinds of work. I remember, for example, Carole Brathwaite's wife being the one who did all of it. You know, she held on travel, library, everything. And generally, in that particular case, when the wife passed, he did not know what to do. Women end up often being self-sufficient. I know from your history that you became that person too after losing Walter. But tell us about, and you mentioned, I'm so happy to hear that Naipaul story, because it coheres so well with how I feel. But tell us a little bit about the kinds of people you met, the kinds of movements, because of that journey, that political journey that he had in so many locations, definitely in Africa. And I know you had friends, like you have one in the audience who you had relationships and friendships with there as well.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you about our dating in London. I worked as a nurse. My training was a nurse, so most times it's difficult to plan because you might be called at an emergency or something. Anyway, Friday nights, every Friday night, all the Caribbean students, a group of Caribbean students met at the home of Selma and C.L.R. James. Richard Small, the late Norman Gervin, Margaret. There were only two women who were consistent. Margaret Hope, because she lived with the Jameses at that time, and Selma James. And so whenever I was off on a Friday night, that was supposed to be our date night, we ended up in a political discussion at C.L.R. James's home. So, and then during the summer, we ended up at Hyde Park, because Walter started speaking at Hyde Park. So that was my life in London. We did do other things. At the West Indian Student Center, Walter loved to dance, he loved music, so we did do other things, but a lot of times would be around political gatherings. When he finished his PhD, initially he wanted to go to West Africa, but his advisor said, look, I think you need to expand and go east instead. And I'm glad we made that choice, because there was something in me immediately connected with Dar es Salaam. I just felt a strong connection. And so we left for Dar es Salaam in 1966. Walter went ahead because I just had a baby, our son Shaka. And I moved to Tanzania when my son was 3 weeks old. People thought I was crazy from England, going to Africa with a three-week-old baby. But it was really the best decision we made. I remember when Walter got the job, they sent you a letter from the colonial office, and they're telling you, you know, what your salary is and all that. But then the wives of these, there was a group called Expatriate Wives or something. They wrote this letter, I wish I had kept it, and in the letter said, we welcome, I think the name Rodney threw them off. We welcome you to Tanzania, but you should not take your good cutlery and pots and pans because the natives will spoil them. Honest to God, Walt and I, we cracked up laughing because we didn't even have any of those things anyway. But it just shows you that the name Rodney, they probably felt they didn't know who we were. So going to Tanzania, I was already trained, qualified as a nurse in England, and the medical officer of health in Tanzania at the time was from Jamaica. And I met him at a party and he said, we're so short of nurses, would you like a job? I said, sure. Because I think in the next 6 months, I have a young baby. He said, no, we're desperate, we need you like next week. So that's how I got my job at the Dar es Salaam City Council, which is your health center. And for the first year, we were there for an academic year, I worked as a school nurse. And that opened my eyes, because we lived on a campus, like 10 miles out. And living on a university campus is not realistic to what the rest of society is. And very few of the university wives worked. So they were, the first month I remember being invited to several coffee mornings, and I decided, no, that's not me, I want a job. So I worked as a school nurse, and that meant I was assigned like 4 schools, and I had an assistant who was also my translator nurse, Mama Liganga. I will never forget her because I would be driving and she would be braking all the time. She said, oh, my legs are hurting me so much. I was speeding. She said, oh, but she was always pressing brakes. But yeah, we would visit the schools and assess the kids, whether they had a fever or a cut, things like that. And I began to think how limited the system was, because we never really were able, because of the mandate of the organization, to delve closer into the experiences those children had. Lots of times they were hungry, they hadn't had breakfast, but that wasn't part of what we could do. But I saw the limitations in the work I was doing. We were just treating some symptoms, actually, and not addressing some of the social problems, because most of the public schools, were children of working class. Other kids went to private schools, so they didn't have that same experience as the children we were seeing. But that's where I got my first public health experience without having a public health degree. So it made me, when I went to graduate school, actually I thought that our class taught the professors, because most of the students, graduate students, came from Africa and other places and were already professionals in their society. So they came with the knowledge. This person was just there to get, so you could get certified.
Right. What I found when I visited Tanzania, particularly down, that it reminded me a lot of the Caribbean in terms of landscape, diet, food, people, combination.
Yeah, and people were. I felt very comfortable in Tanzania. The only problem I had once, I remember, I went to a conference organized by the U.S. Family Planning Association. They were there. Promoting Depo-Provera, what Depo-Provera is. And so I got up and asked a question, right? And this woman had the audacity to say to me, well, you are not a Tanzanian. I said, I'm not a Tanzanian, but an African woman, and I want to speak on behalf of women. I didn't even know it got back to President Nyerere. So he actually banned the use of Depo-Provera in Tanzania. But I didn't know who told him or how he got it, yeah.
But you see, what you're saying tells us you were not just a witness, you were a participant. And at the same time, you were part of Caribbean Black Power movements, right? Pan-Africanist movements, clearly. Black Power in the United States as well was part of his experience and yours. So how, would some of these radical political movements impact how you began to respond, you would say?
I think Jamaica was a point in my life where I realized, oh my God, this is it. We did the first academic year, as I said, in Tanzania, and then he was offered a position to go back to his alma mater, UWI Jamaica, to teach African history. We got there in January of 1968, and I thought it was a long haul for us that we would be there, because I worked as a nurse at the university hospital, but then I decided I wanted to finish my undergraduate degree. So I registered as a student in the sociology department at UWI, I think in September, and by October, water was banned from Jamaica. So my own education has taken these, hit highs and lows. But in Jamaica, I hadn't visited Jamaica before then, and I was so overwhelmed by the beauty of Jamaica. I mean, I fell in love when we landed, and Walter said to me, when you settle into the hotel, I'll take you for a drive to show you the real Jamaica. And so I could see these huge houses on, what's the place called? The hills, on the hills, is a particular name for the hills. And then down below were the dungles, or, where people lived on cardboard boxes. The wealth disparity was, I'd never seen that in Africa. That was so blatant as I saw it in Jamaica. So that was my first light that went off in my head, that, something is not right in this society. And then Walter started to do a lot of discussion at a students' union with the students. He availed himself to not just the university, but to high schools to talk about African history. He was supposed to do a course on the radio, and all those things were quietly shut down. They didn't want to really, they wanted African history to be at the university, not to be outside, because it would raise people's consciousness, and that's what's happened, because the Rastafarians have always had a connection to Africa. As Walter said in his book, Groundings with My Brothers, the Rastas taught him a lot, because they knew their African history. They understood what was going on in the society. So suddenly, Rodney was dangerous, not because he had a gun, but because he was sharing knowledge. Knowledge is more powerful than arms in some situations. But I was able to meet an amazing amount of Caribbean radicals during that time. I said Norman Gervin, what's his name? I'm trying to think. I said Richard Small, but the other one who was a political scientist. There were so many people. I even met Amy Garvey.
Oh,
yeah.
The two Amy's.
The second Amy.
Oh, you met Amy J.
the second Lady James.
Right.
She lived not far from the university,
Oh,
and one of our friends rented a room in her house, so I saw her quite often. And when we did the demonstration for Rodney, she was up there waving us on. So there are amazing people, not just important people, ordinary people in Jamaica who were quite conscious about what was going on in their society and how black people were perceived in a predominantly black society. And I think that I remember us going to Trenchtown. We used to go to Trenchtown to see some of our Rasta friends. And I remember vividly, we were in the car in front. Norman was in the car behind us and a couple of other people. And when we entered, the Rastas put down the security. And Walter said, those are my friends. And the Rasta guy said, you have to vouch for them because these university people only come to study us. They don't come to talk to us. So, and Norman is a Jamaican.
wow, that's brilliant.
So they said, he had to sanction, no, these guys are with me, and that's how they were.
That is amazing. But let me ask you this, since we're in a university context, and that's a really critical point you make in there. But I have a colleague who you know really well, Monica Jadi.
Yes.
And for her, the standard of writing a dissertation was how Europe underdeveloped Africa. So Walter's thesis became the sort of standard for many Caribbean scholars. And of course, they never could reach to that point because you were talking about him going Portugal, you know, Spain, everywhere to do that work. So we have to tell students often, okay, Walter Rodney's thesis is a high benchmark, and we strive towards that, but we may not always get there. But tell us a little bit about his passion for intellectual work, because he is a noted African historian coming from the Caribbean, and even Caribbean universities, and recently we did a panel on the Venezuela situation, and it came out that they're not teaching history in the schools.
No, not even at the secondary
think about
level
that.
and at university.
Yeah.
There's no history department in Guyana. There's a social sciences department,
Yeah.
which does not make sense. But Walter's always been rigid in terms of his work. He spent, like, everybody in Guyana knew him because he was probably the only person who was in the archives. And I left, to finish my degree, I had to go to Jamaica for a year. So I left him with my parents and in-laws to look after the children. And my mother used to be very upset because she would say, Walter, these children are... He said, no, mother, I can look after them. And he would just put their hair in some rubber bands, but he would take them to the archives with him. And also, people at archives knew that he came with a dustpan and broom that he would clean up, you know, where he was, because they never paid much attention to the archives. So the archives was named after him on the PPP government, and then when the other government came in, they took down his name from it, and then it had to go back to Parliament in order for them to name the archives after him. But I remember students in Tanzania particularly, they would come to his office to try to talk to him about politics. And he'd say, it's okay, but remember you have to turn in my paper tomorrow. And so he wasn't about, you know, people not doing the work. He was very meticulous about that. And I think Kanini became his favorite because she, from very early on, I don't know if she figured it out that that's the way to get her father with books, but she would sit at his feet reading books while Shaka was off playing cricket or something, right? But she was the studious one who was always in his study. Even when I was doing my final exam in England, he helped me to study for that exam. He was the one that encouraged me when I said I can't leave the children to go to Jamaica for a year. He said, no, we can manage this. You go and finish it. And I'm so thankful for that, because without having that first degree, I would not have been able to be as independent as I was when I moved to Barbados. Because if I was just doing nursing, I couldn't control my time. As I got my first job was as a medical social worker at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, which gave me a lot of flexibility in terms of how I can make sure that my children were taken care of. I lost.
But what I want to know though is your work, because your book, The Caribbean State, Healthcare and Women, analyzes Caribbean public health systems through the changing political regimes. And what I picked up from you now, oh sorry about that. What I picked up from, I was mentioning that her book, the title, let me call it out again because I did not have to write. The Caribbean State, Healthcare and Women. Wonderful, which analyzes Caribbean public health. But I'm thinking, because what she indicated earlier was her work in Tanzania as well, working with the children and so on. So if you could tell us a little bit about health, women, children, and how you see your own contribution occupying some of that niche that still needs a lot of work, right?
Yeah. Well, I started out in Guyana. When I finished high school, I taught for a year. I taught first graders. I loved them. But then I always wanted to travel, and I felt that teaching wouldn't get me there. So I applied to do nursing in England, which I did. I qualified as a state registered nurse. And it's funny how colonial systems operate, because going to Tanzania as a nurse trained in England, you were given so much responsibility and respect that local nurses didn't. And that's true not just for Tanzania. Even in the Caribbean, when you're trained abroad, people think you know everything.
Right.
So my first was nursing within a clinical setting. In hospitals mainly. Going to Tanzania gave me that community experience. And then when we moved from Tanzania to Jamaica, I worked again in a hospital setting. And I remember this case in particular. I worked on the antenatal wards. And this woman was admitted that night, and I decided to stop and talk to her for some reason. And she was crying. And I said, what's the matter, you're going to be well taken care of here. And she said, no, I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about my children. Because I came to the hospital today and I didn't know I was going to be admitted. And I don't know what's going to happen to them. And I said, okay, I'll make some calls for you, which I did. But it kind of triggered something in me that nursing is just a step to doing something else, because I couldn't help her as a nurse. I needed some more skills to help her. And so when we got to Guyana, Walter didn't have a job. I got there before Walter in Guyana, and I was the one who called him to tell him that he didn't get the job. The only reason I knew he wasn't getting the job, I wanted to purchase a home for us because we were staying with relatives. And so I went to the university to get a letter to take to the mortgage company. And the guy said, you can't get any letter because your husband doesn't have a job. I said, really? And so I called up Walter. He was in the States actually. He might have been somewhere around here. I called him up until he said, never mind. He said, I'm coming home. He said, even if I have to drive a taxi, that's my home. I'm coming home. And I'm saying this to say, I heard people say, Rodney, used to drive a taxi to support his family. He never did, but he would have if he had to. So he came home anyway. But by the time he came home, I had bought a house, returned to our school, and I had a job. And that job was, I was in charge of an early childhood education center. The center, this particular center, was in a working class neighborhood, which people say was dangerous, according to them, because working class people live there. So I was in charge of that center. And I think people, I don't know if they put me there deliberately to see if I would fail, but I didn't. What I did was, I went around the neighborhood, met all the parents, I found a parent committee, I got all my petty bourgeoisie friends to donate to the clinic toys and books. I got my own dentist to come in and check those kids. And I remember parents telling me, they used to call me Auntie Patsy Matron. So if they would go home and the parents said, go and eat your meal. No, I have to wash my hands first because Auntie Patricia Matron said I have to. So parents would be coming to me all the time, I can't get my child to do anything because unless you say they're not doing. And like 2 years ago, I was at a conference at CAU, and this young man came up to me. And he said, you don't know me, but I know you. He said, I went to that nursery where you was the matron. And he said, I've never forgotten you. He said, you've made, and these were little kids. Once they turned 5+, they went to primary school. So I had them from 3 months old until they were 5.
Wow.
But that also, and having the Parents Association, the parents bought into the center. I would, parents would come and do anything, repair things. They would donate to the center when they can. And I remember an incident where, because at that time it was the PNC government, the mayor came to visit the center. She only came to visit because the staff complained about me. So she came. I knew who she was because she was very prominent in the church I went to. And I was very good friends with her kids. But obviously, I'm now a Rodney, so she didn't want to recognize who I was or anything. So she came and she said, I come to see your clinic. And I said, excuse me, could you tell me who you are? She said, don't you know who I am? I'm the mayor. I said, it was a pleasure to meet you.
Wow.
So I told her, come into my office. I asked if she wanted some tea and all that, right? So she left. She said, what's the problem? I said, well, the staff here said that they would get my head rolled because, you know what you mean your head rolled? They'd get me fired. They don't have to do anything. They could turn up when they want to. And because they were all political appointees. And they knew what was going on with my husband. So I said, they're very lazy to turn up whenever they wanted. Blah, blah, blah. She said, okay. She went back to City Hall. And my friends from City Hall told me, what did you do to the matron? Because she said she went in and she told the workers, anything Mrs. Rodney wants, she must get it immediately.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
But tell us about women, though, because we have a few minutes. I know that
Okay.
the time is
I'll
on
go
really
to
quickly. No, but tell us about
One?
oh,
About when?
no, and just the questions of how you, because of your work in health, how are you looking at women's health in the U.S. and the Caribbean? What kinds of issues are we still struggling to get on top of, to conquer?
Well, health in the U.S. is very commodified.
Okay.
It's not a very coordinated system. It's very fragmented. You have to see 6 different people to get, the care you need. In my impression about good health and public health was my own experiences in Cuba. I've taken students, I think I was probably the only HBCU public health program to take students to Cuba. For them to, and it was funny, they were very scared to go at first, you know, because they've been told all these lies about how it's dangerous and all that. But it made a difference to their outlook towards the world. In Cuba, it's very organized, the healthcare system. And what the Cubans did after the revolution was two things. They made sure that people were literate. So they had this massive campaign. And because you can't deal with your own health if you can't read, write, understand, and comprehend. So the Cuban population are highly literate in terms of their health, in terms of monitoring their own health. When a primary healthcare physician visits the home, which they do, if the patient can't come, they visit the home, they have a discussion with the entire family about what is what we now call fancy the social determinants of health, which is a socio-political, economic, environmental aspect. The basic things, food, housing, and all those things that you need to have in order to enjoy good health. My move towards women's health, well, I'm a woman, came about when I worked with WAND, Women Development Unit in Barbados. I was program officer for 2 countries, Grenada and Dominica. And our main work at that time was to do some consciousness raising and non-traditional skills, training women in areas like refrigeration, mechanics, and all that, you know, things that women didn't normally do so that they can be self-sufficient. But in talking to women, I found out our program was lacking in that sense, because we were not dealing with the issues that they had as women. And I think a group that had a big impact on me looking at women's health in a different way too was the National Black Women's Health Project. I met them at the Nairobi conference, and then I invited them to Barbados. I organized the first Black Women's Conference, health conference in Barbados. Angela came, Angela Davis came, Billy Avery, and the health is knowing your body, knowing yourselves. Nobody can understand your health the way you do. And in particular women, we have usually a gut feeling about things. And lots of times we ignore that feeling. So I tell people in terms of going to the doctor, it's like buying a car or going to buy something. You know everything, you read all the things about buying a car, right? You survey it. But with your own health, you hand it over to somebody in a white coat. And that's the difference in terms of the Cubans have been able to demystify health in a way that I have not seen it anywhere else, that people are conscious of themselves as human beings, like all over Cuba you see people doing Tai Chi and things like that that you don't normally see in a society. So my focus, and the way I got to do my public health and to focus on women, I was actually doing a workshop in Grenada, and the program officer from the US who was funding us, the Inter-American Foundation, they paid with my salary actually. I didn't know she was there. She was standing outside, and I was doing this workshop with women, asking them about their needs and all that. And when we finished the workshop, she said, you know what? you should apply for one of our fellowships because you really need to do public health and expand one's program in terms of this segment on health, because it's often ignored. Women's health, it's not taken seriously. Doctors look, and the whole system is set up to look at maternal and child health. I'm not saying that's not important, but women have a longer lifespan than that. And we don't look at some of the other issues that women have in their lives outside of your childbearing and reproductive issues. So that's where I've kind of taken my own work to look at some of those other issues that women face.
Right, you mentioned Cuba and just encouraging people in the audience, if you have any connections or whatever you can, because the US blockade is just destroying whatever they had created, and it's really hard. And it's a very painful topic because you feel sort of complicit in a way just from being here in this horrible system. So I just thought, as you mentioned, Cuba and public health, that it's important to see that as well.
And I think Grenada learned a lot. I was very impressed with what Grenada was trying to do during the revolution. And my study is post the revolution, post the invasion. But the memory of people of that period was so important. They talked about the Cuban doctors, and the Cuban doctors, their humanity, where the doctors, Caribbean doctors, were very aloof. But the Cuban doctors, even though they might have had a language barrier, the way they treated people were quite different, and that's significant. And that goes back to the way the Cuban doctors are trained. They're not trained to make money in medicine. Medicine and health is a human right, and they are servants of the people. So there's a real difference in the way training is done. It's not commodified.
Yeah, just keep that in mind as Marco Rubio distorts that he's doing his whole campaign to distort what the Cuban
and it's affecting the Caribbean, because I'm not sure how the Caribbean will manage without the Cuban doctors or the Cuban services. Like the majority of the population in Barbados go to Cuba for ophthalmology. But I don't blame the Cubans, I blame Caribbean leaders, that if you stand united, they can probably destroy you. But they went to them individually, divide and rule, and I don't know what's going to happen, because a lot of people from the Caribbean who went to study medicine in Cuba would never have been able to study medicine because they couldn't afford it. And so they got that opportunity, and they are the best doctors in the Caribbean.
Also, black urban doctors. There's students from Binghamton who went to Cuba. Many of them worked with COVID really well in New York. One of them. I told you I was doing this research in Cuba, and I met a lot of them. Right. Right. And one of them who I know really well, works in the Harlem Hospital still right now in Children's Division. But tell us what you think of current developments, anything you want to say to students as a final question, and we'll turn it over to you because we know you have many questions. But just closing comments, what would you say to our students, to Howard, to young people, to scholars? Anything from your experience that you'd love to share?
I think you can't be afraid to seek truth, because you have to live with yourself. And so it's going to be hard, but it's something that you have to use your education for a purpose. It's not just about ending up in an academy and talking to each other. And that's one of the reasons I did my research in that way, because I wanted to bring out the voices of women, of people. And I think that's what you need to do, just seek, do the best work you can, that people can challenge your work.
Right.
You have to do the work, you can't just skip by. But that work should be used in the liberation of our people.
Yes. Wonderful. Yes.